An international court just issued an arrest warrant for a former president of the United States. Let that sink in for a moment. Not a rumor, not a political attack. An arrest warrant issued by the International Criminal Court. Trump's team calls it an act of war. Washington calls it illegitimate. But the real question isn't whether the court has authority. The real question is this: what happens when the world decides that American power no longer comes with immunity? I've spent decades studying how global systems break. They don't collapse with explosions. They fracture quietly through precedent. Because if this warrant stands, it doesn't just redefine Donald Trump. It redefines the presidency itself. And if you think this story is about one man, you're missing the danger. Stay with me. Because once you understand how we got here, you'll see why this moment could reshape global order far beyond the next election. To understand why this arrest warrant matters, we need to strip away the noise. Forget Trump's personality. Forget campaign politics. This is about jurisdiction versus power. For decades, the United States has operated on a simple assumption. International law applies to everyone except those strong enough to ignore it. That assumption is now being tested. The International Criminal Court is not chasing a headline. It is challenging a doctrine that says American presidents are untouchable beyond U.S. borders. And here's where the tension becomes explosive. The United States does not recognize the ICC, yet the ICC claims authority when crimes against humanity are alleged. That collision creates a legal vacuum, and history shows that vacuums never stay empty. So this isn't a legal footnote. It's a stress test of the entire post-World War II order. If the rules bend here, they bend everywhere. And to see how we reached this point, we have to go back not to this warrant, but to the choices that made it inevitable. To understand why this confrontation was almost unavoidable, we need historical context. Not legal theory, political behavior. Donald Trump didn't stumble into conflict with international institutions. He built his presidency around rejecting them. From the Paris Climate Agreement to NATO pressure to open contempt for the United Nations, Trump framed global cooperation as weakness. Sovereignty, in his view, meant insulation from external judgment. That posture mattered, because while the White House was dismissing global norms publicly, international institutions were doing the opposite, documenting quietly. For 18 months, the ICC gathered testimony, not speeches, not ideology, evidence. Family separation at the southern border wasn't seen as a policy failure. It was framed as systematic harm, carried out with intent, and justified internally as deterrence. History shows this pattern clearly. When power treats institutions as irrelevant, institutions respond by hardening. This wasn't sudden. It was cumulative. And once that threshold is crossed, the system stops asking permission. Which brings us to the first moment when this conflict stopped being abstract and turned into a crisis. The moment this stopped being theoretical was October. That's when reports confirmed the ICC had moved beyond review and into escalation. Not speculation, active preparation. A 200-page dossier surfaced, testimonies from separated families, internal communications showing awareness of harm, expert analysis on psychological trauma inflicted on children. This wasn't framed as a mistake. It was framed as intent. That distinction changes everything, because under international law, intent transforms policy into liability. And liability demands accountability. Inside Washington, alarms went off. Federal prosecutors scrambled. State Department officials convened emergency meetings. Constitutional scholars were pulled into real-time crisis mode. This wasn't about Trump alone anymore. It was about whether presidential immunity had limits. If the ICC succeeded here, it would establish a precedent no American leader had ever faced. Pay attention to that word, precedent. Because once precedent exists, it doesn't stay contained. And as this pressure mounted, Trump made a decision, one that didn't diffuse the situation. It detonated it. Here's the part most people miss. International courts don't move on outrage. They move on patterns. What triggered this escalation wasn't a single policy or a single decision. It was the systematic nature of what followed. Human rights organizations documented repeated cases where children were separated, parents were deported, and reunification became impossible. Not accidentally. Structurally, inside the ICC, that pattern mattered more than political rhetoric, because international law isn't designed to judge intentions declared on television. It judges consequences proven on paper. And the deeper investigators went, the clearer the mechanism became. Deterrence through suffering, cruelty as signal. That framing reframed everything. Once an action is defined as deliberately inflicting severe harm on a civilian population, jurisdiction becomes secondary. The court doesn't ask whether it is welcome. It asks whether silence would destroy its own credibility. That's the hidden engine here. The ICC wasn't chasing Trump. It was defending the authority of international law itself. And when institutions feel their legitimacy threatened, they escalate, which is exactly what happened next. This is where everything spiraled. Instead of de-escalating, Trump went on offense. He didn't challenge the evidence. He challenged the court itself. He called the ICC a kangaroo court. He rejected its legitimacy outright. And then he crossed a line that international systems take very seriously. Threats, publicly naming court officials, encouraging supporters to harass them, floating the idea of military action against The Hague. At that point, this stopped being a dispute over jurisdiction. It became a question of obstruction. Under the Rome Statute, intimidating judicial officers isn't rhetoric. It's a crime. Inside the Republican Party, panic set in. Allies began backing away. Diplomats found doors closing. Businesses warned of international fallout. What had been a legal risk turned into a governance crisis. And here's the key insight. International courts can tolerate defiance. They cannot tolerate intimidation. Because if judges can be threatened into silence, the system collapses. That's why the ICC didn't slow down. It accelerated, and the consequences of that decision wouldn't stay confined to courtrooms. They would land squarely on ordinary people, including you. Here's where this stops being abstract and starts affecting you. Because when institutions collide, ordinary people absorb the shock. If a leading presidential candidate is under an international arrest warrant, diplomacy doesn't just strain, it freezes. Trade slows. Alliances hesitate. Markets price in instability, and that instability lands on jobs, prices, and trust. You don't need to care about the ICC to feel its consequences. You feel them when American passports lose leverage, when allies stop taking calls, when chaos replaces predictability. Democracy depends on one fragile assumption, that those in power respect limits. When leaders threaten judges, dismiss law, and normalize defiance, the message spreads fast. Rules become optional. Institutions become enemies. Truth becomes negotiable. That's not theoretical. That's how systems decay. So this moment matters not because of Trump's legal fate, but because of what it teaches future leaders they can get away with. If you care about stability, accountability, and the kind of world you live in, this isn't someone else's problem. It's yours. And the world is already responding. What happens inside Washington never stays inside Washington. Once the warrant became public, the shockwave moved fast. Allies reassessed risk. Diplomats recalculated distance. Institutions that rely on predictability began preparing for rupture. For decades, the United States sat at the center of a rules-based order it helped design. That position depended on credibility, not force alone. Now that credibility is under strain. When a major political figure dismisses international law while threatening its enforcers, it sends a signal far beyond America. Other leaders are watching closely. So are other courts. If this warrant collapses under pressure, it tells the world that power still outranks rules. If it holds, it tells the world that even the powerful face limits. Either outcome reshapes behavior. This is why international opinion shifted so quickly. Polls turned. Support for accountability hardened. Distance replaced deference. The global system isn't reacting emotionally. It's adapting rationally. And that adaptation leads to one unavoidable question. What comes next? Because once systems are stressed this way, they don't return to normal. They choose a path. And there are only a few possible futures. From here, the system has only three paths. The first is containment. The warrant exists, but politics overwhelm enforcement. The case stalls. Institutions retreat quietly to preserve stability. This keeps the peace temporarily. But it teaches a dangerous lesson. Power can still outweigh accountability. The second path is fragmentation. The ICC pushes forward. The United States pushes back. Alliances strain under pressure to choose sides. International law survives, but selectively, applied unevenly, respected conditionally. That's how systems hollow out from within. The third path is precedent. The warrant holds, threats are punished, limits are enforced. This path is the most disruptive in the short term and the most stabilizing in the long run, because it reasserts a principle the post-war order was built on. No individual stands above the system. None of these futures are painless, but only one preserves legitimacy. History doesn't ask which outcome feels comfortable. It rewards the one that restores balance. And the choice won't be made by courts alone. It will be shaped by politics, pressure, and public tolerance for chaos. Which brings us to the final question and the final responsibility. So this isn't just a story about Donald Trump. It's a stress test of a world built after catastrophe, a system designed to prevent power from becoming untouchable again. If an American president can threaten judges, ignore warrants, and face no consequences, the message is clear. Rules only matter when they're convenient. And once that belief spreads, democracy doesn't collapse overnight. It erodes quietly, predictably. What happens next will define more than an election. It will define whether international law still restrains the powerful or whether we've entered an era where force replaces legitimacy. This is the moment when institutions either hold or hollow out. And history shows us something uncomfortable. Systems don't fail because people stop believing in them. They fail because people stop defending them. If you want to understand where global order is heading next and what happens when accountability disappears, stay with this conversation. Because this case isn't ending here. It's just the opening chapter. And what comes next may matter even more than the warrant itself. Subscribe, stay engaged, and don't look away.